Let us now proceed on to Marx's philosophical underpinnings. Hegel, as mentioned earlier, had seen both idea and matter to develop in a dialectical method, whereas other idealists, and Hegel is an idealist, had considered change as illusory, with ethics and morality remaining the same in all times. Hegel argued in favor of a change that is not incessant but also progressive in nature. If you convert Hegel in the language of conventional monotheism, even God changes then, according to him. If you follow him. Both Marx and Engels accept Hegel's theory of change, except to further refine it. They further refined it. Marx says, for example, there is only one unchanging law, and that is everything changes. Well, beautifully said. That's the law, everything changes. Mao Zedong further elaborates it when he says, everything changes unevenly. Of course, in the 20th century, he would be saying this, basing on Marx. Not only do they accept change as real and incessant, they also concur with Hegel when he says that these changes lead to development. Development is essential in human society because man is a thinking animal. It is not caused by the intrusion of ideas from any supernatural force, but by the capacity created out of nature. That is to say, by a capacity created by man, thus Feuerbach's approval of Marx. Feuerbach we have already discussed. This development is very uneven. That is to say, it suffers from a lot many recessions at specific regions or time spans. Seen from a distant perspective, however, the human society keeps in developing by a process of contradictions caused by exploitation. The nature of society essentially has to be judged by the nature of exploitation of that society. The influence of Marx can be seen in two ways. One is how the Marxist historiography itself developed. Among historians who studied history in an essentially Marxist framework, the Marxist school is surprisingly late, and systematic beginnings of this school began to be noticed only after the Russian Revolution of 1917. It became cogent and comprehensive in the 1930s and 1940s among the Soviet historians first, who seemed anxious to attempt a worldwide classification of mode of productions. Often they tended to become mechanical and stereotyped in their application of Marxist tools. By the 1960s, the straitjacket progression got removed and a large number of new theories began to develop, most notable perhaps being the rejection of orthodox Marxist categories and the integration of psychological factors with the materialist, as in the case of Rodinson's biography. I mean Maxim Rodinson's biography of Prophet Muhammad. He also wrote another book in which also again you will find Marxist ideology is very evident, that is Islam and Capitalism. He has touched those points, how the mode of production is deciding those superstructures. The new Marxists, so to say, also began to emphasize the colonial relationship as being more essential and crucial to capitalism than was recognized by Marx. Notable in this context are the works of Rosa Luxemburg and Shamir Amin. After the Chinese Revolution and following Mao's writings, role of peasantry in history also began to be increasingly studied. Bolshevik Revolution took place. At that time, there was a debate going on between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Mensheviks were saying that that is not the right time to have revolution, and Bolsheviks were saying that we have sufficient working class at our in the country because of the industrialization. Therefore, the conditions were ripe for a revolution where through which workers could unite and think of controlling the state political power, meaning thereby that they could become the rulers, they would be deciding the fate of others. So, apart from a Marxist school, the influence of Marx was also considerable among the non-Marxists. It has often been said by many that Marx was the founder of economics and sociology. Literally, he is neither, but given his contributions to both these fields, he deserves being termed as their founder. In the field of economics, the basic Marxian contribution that even the non-Marxists also concede recognizes the perception of looking at economic phenomenon in the totality of relationships as determined by a multitudes of factors. Before Marx, economic history was treated as a disjuncted study of trade and commerce, tax structure, etc. After Marx, no historian worth the salt, whether Marxist or non-Marxist, could afford to write truncated history of economics. It has to be comprehensive, it has to be in totality. For assessing Marx's contribution in the field of sociology, one needs to go to an earlier scholar, Augustus Comte, born in 1857, who is credited with sealing the sealing word sociology after first toying with the term social physics. Comte's work on positive philosophy came out in 1850s. Apart from the Marxist school, this is the contribution of Marx. The influence of Marx was also considerable among the non-Marxists. It has often been said by many that Marx was the founder of economics and sociology. Literally, he is neither, but given his substantial contributions in both these fields, he deserves being termed as its founder. In the field of economics, the basic Marxian contribution that even the non-Marxists recognize is the perception of looking at economic phenomenon in the totality of relationships as determined by a multitude of factors. Before Marx, economic history was treated as a disjuncted study of trade and commerce, tax structure, etc. One of the themes of the economics. After Marx, no historian, whether Marxist or non-Marxist, could afford to write truncated history of economics. For assessing Marx's contribution in the field of sociology, one needs to go to an earlier scholar, Auguste Comte, 1798-1857, who is credited with the coining of the word sociology after first trying with the term social physics. That was the term given by him. So, Comte's work on positive philosophy came out in the 1850s in several volumes. Almost all thought till Comte that had been essentially metaphysical, being an advance on the earlier thought which was theological. That is to say, all philosophers agreed the primacy of ideas and considered in one way or other social behavior, social organization or society as being necessarily determined by ideas emanating from some kind of supernatural force. The business of scholars was thought to be to analyze how these supernatural or in any case extremely mysterious ideas have guided the destinies of the mankind. Comte rejected metaphysics and sought to substitute it by what he termed positive philosophy. By positive philosophy, he meant that in the study of society, the same principles should be applied that were being used in the study of pure sciences. Thus, no doctrine or philosophy on any social or human phenomenon can be accepted as valid unless it is substantiated by observation and experimentation. In a departure from earlier thinkers, he argued that the aim of all knowledge is human improvement. and for this reason he did not set out to explain phenomenon, but accepted it as it is, seeking in it avenues for human development. All knowledge, according to him, deduces certain laws, and it is on the basis of these laws, or with these laws in the backdrop, that one needs to promulgate state laws or legally enforceable ordinances if they are to reform society. Objective was to reform society. He also attempted a classification of knowledge on the basis of how empirical the knowledge is. Thus, in his pyramidal classification, mathematics was at the base, it being the most abstract of all sciences, and sociology at the top, it begins the science of sciences, according to Marx. He propounded certain absurdities too, I may be pardoned for that, such as theory of cerebral hygiene. Marx had obviously read Comte, though he seems not very much impressed by him. His answer to metaphysics was not Comte's positivism, but materialism. They both agreed that the aim of all knowledge should be human welfare, and that in studying society, one should use methods and tools similar to those used in natural sciences. As I said in the beginning, in all other respects, perhaps Marx had nothing to share with Comte. In the field of sociology, one notable contribution of Marx has been to relate the study of society to a very strong grasp of history. History as rooted in material conditions, and that is why he called it historical materialism. This led him to introduce the concept of class divisions, class structure, and class struggle into the domain of sociology, and equally significant to integrate into the subject, into the subject what is known as the economic basis. Marx's, one of the fundamental contribution is his discussion of historical materialism. This is, highly relevant for any student of historical methodology. The essential word in Marxism is dialectic. All human relations, the study of which in fact is history, are essentially dialectical in nature. That is to say, they consist of contradictions, which is given the fact that for every human action, natural to expect a reaction insofar as it changes the existing structure or circumstances. In other words, every action can be seen as leading to the contradictions. When you are dealing with societies at large, you are necessarily dealing with multitudes of contradictions, and the initial job of historian therefore is to identify the major contradiction. Mao Zedong, in an essay on contradictions, points out that all societies at all points of time have a major contradiction and a number of secondary contradictions, subsidiary contradictions, one of which may later on become major contradiction, and the major one becomes a secondary contradiction, depending on the situation and changes. Therefore, as circumstances change, so do major contradictions, and the identification of a major contradiction within the ambit of those many contradictions. Furthermore, this major contradiction exists in relation to a multitude of other secondary contradictions. All individuals who compose human society are engaged in a perpetual effort to alter these contradictions in their favor. Thus, contradictions are not created or removed by God or mysterious ideas as propounded by Hegel, but by human action. The man himself is responsible for this. The second important element in Marxian theory is that of change and uneven development. Since man is a thinking animal, nothing can remain static in human societies. Everything changes accordingly. According to Marx, I quote, "There is no unchanging law except that everything changes." I reiterate this, earlier also I had pointed this out. Everything changes, but change is not an inevitable or predetermined direction. Nobody has determined, earlier, because all changes involve myriads of human thought and actions. Thus, everything changes, according to Mao, unevenly. This is a very important point to remember because often Marxism has been criticized by scholars like Althusser, for example, for providing a deterministic interpretation of history. This is not deterministic, it is very dynamic. So far, we have arrived at three major elements of Marxism. What are they? Number one, theory of contradiction. Then second, theory of major contradictions as against secondary number of contradictions, and theory of uneven change. What follows next obviously is the question, how do we determine the major contradiction? What is the major contradiction? How to identify it? This leads us to second major contradiction of Marxism, that is materialism. This is a major contradiction. So, a recognition of ascendancy of material forces over ideas is a major contradiction. In historical terms, according to T. A. Jackson, materialism is to see production of forces as a major element in human activity. The primary need of human beings is to have food, obviously, necessities and comforts. It is therefore important for man how he gets these things, how he satisfies them, and for the society is how it distributes them, how it brings it to for his disposal. Society can distribute these only when man acts on nature, and a large number of its constituents are involved in the production processes. Thus, production is the primary activity, and how and what is produced is then distributed and consumed by different sections of the people in varying proportions as its primary elements. Marxian theory thus combines the theory of contradiction with that of materialism, and is for this reason the theory is known as the theory of dialectical materialism. So, Marxian assumption that human beings are primarily concerned with how goods consumed are produced is not capable of logical proof. It is a premise to which logic can't be applied. Belief in historical inevitability is the last resort of a strong will in a weak position, said Gramsci. So, the first major supposition is the primacy of production activities, followed by the distribution of produced goods. This is followed by the supposition that production forces imply incessant development. In this, Darwin's theory of origin of a species greatly, infused Marx. Archaeological findings have also immensely supported Marx. Taking his theory further, Engels in his Origins of Private Property, Family and State argued that in the period of primitive communism, when man produced barely for his subsistence, human social behavior, concept of ethics and morality were very different from the period when he began to produce surplus. These are two different periods with different, susceptibilities and expectations. As surplus began to be created, on one hand arose a stable production system, that is a settled agriculture, and on the other a different set of superstitions and moral codes, such as cult of mother goddess, the creates, she is the creator, and abhorrence towards cannibalism, because now you have sufficient food, so what is the use of going for cannibalism? What is more important than these development was that surplus created exploitations by fostering inequalities. Since then, that is to say, since man created surplus, society has always been divided into two major classes, the oppressors or the oppressed, or exploiter or exploited. Exploitation is the third major ingredient to Marxism. Since man began to produce surplus, he has been divided into numerous classes, of which two major classes are the class of exploiters and of exploited, and it is in the exploitation of dominant class that primary contradiction in society lies. The nature of exploitation varies, but it is this, preeminent fact of exploitation that determines the other details of all societies, those that relates to its ideology, morality, ethics, etc., etc. When the primitive society is seen in this framework, when you start looking at this framework, the production of surplus assumes importance then. Surplus is that part of produce which goes to the exploiter who either directly consumes it or obtains other things he needs, both in cash and kind. With this, exploitation becomes the major element of civilized history, civilized within quote, as propounded by Engels in his written history. He has used this expression. Even historians like Toynbee, as we will see later, agree to the importance of surplus in bringing changes in the society. The fact that everything changes is an essential element of Marxian perception. Marx nonetheless believed that within the process of change is a continuity also. But when applied to history, Marx called it social formation, continuation. The dominant thing in the social formation are techniques of production, relations of production, and class struggle. Obviously, it is created by these two. When surplus extraction began, depending upon a particular available technique of production, technology I mean, a particular relationship of production developed. A particular form of class struggle began. For example, in tribes, when there was no surplus production, cannibalism was practiced. Later, when agricultural production began, enough surplus is created, members of the subjugated tribe were not eaten but enslaved. Had they been eaten, who would be cultivating their fields then? In this early form of agricultural production, which Marx called antiquity, slavery was the mode of exploitation. Slaves were treated by the masters in the same way as peasants treated their cattle. Similarly, they were not better than cattle. They wanted to keep them alive to draw from them labor services without wages. Gordon Childe has illustrated how change in technology changes the relationship of production. What Childe actually meant by iron democratizing agriculture was that under stone tools production was limited. Bronze was used by very few people who could afford it. Iron was incredibly cheaper in comparison to other metals, and its use brought more lands and more crops under cultivation, and this facilitated transition to feudalism. This is what he means by use of iron and democratization of agriculture when he says that. Under feudalism, the production remained independent but tied to the land. They worked on the domain of the Lord in the beginning. There was a specific portion of land for a specific period, time of the month or during the harvest time or sowing times, and subsequently paid grain or money rent to the Lord. This position was different from slavery. Why? Because, and similarly under capitalism, the wage laborers become more free. There is mobility of labor under capitalism, but mobility of labor you will not find in the previous two schemes. Whether slave mode of production or feudal mode of production, they are tied to the land. If the labor starts moving, then who will tell their lands? So that is why he means by this, that it changes. While the hitherto apparent expropriation of surplus became hidden in the form of surplus value. Marx, in his casual remarks, illustrates how change in the techniques of production change the corresponding relations of exploitation. For example, he gives the example of watermills. I quote, "The watermills gave you feudalism, the steam engine gave you capitalism. The source of power changes. In one mode of production, changes do occur in society, but the social formation remains the same. Each social formation has a dominant mode of production, that is, pockets of slavery in feudalism, merchants employing labor under capitalism also. The economic basis of society cannot be wholly materialistic. For instance, machinery in itself represents dead labor unless idea is applied to it for its functioning. Material and human forces therefore both interact to introduce changes in technology. Maurice Dobb has questioned this premise. Why great mechanical inventions took place in 18th century England to bring about the Industrial Revolution when the techniques were all present? What was the need in one form or the other in the 14th century Italy? So, his answer to this was the absence of an economic organization elsewhere. Over the economic basis, there is a superstructure which is in relation with the basis. Economic forces provide limit to what superstructure would be. The classical Christian formula was that God created man in his image. Feuerbach had reversed this idea. It has been revealed that cult of mother goddess develops only in agrarian societies, agricultural societies. The concept of God emerges in a slave and trade society. As phrases like Lord, Swami, Rab, Master, they very well imply that you are my Lord, you are my Master. So the concept of monotheism emerges with the concept of invisible property. The concept of humanity is possible only with trade. Similarly, the concept of equality of man and women was not possible under feudalism because both had different production relations, came to be recognized only under capitalism. Hence, base conditions, that is ideas and all perceptions are modified by the material base. So, as to whether the superstructure influences the base, there are two statements of Marx which are very important and relevant for us. One, I quote, ideas become material force when they grip the masses. And second is, from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, as he said in the Critique of Gotha program. This is a very good pamphlet. With the progress of human society, what is today the recognition of necessity would give more freedom of thought with reduced labor time and increased machine efficiency. This is capitalism. Another question of vital importance is, how do these changes occur in society then? Marx says, through class struggle. These changes occur through class struggle. There are unconscious, objective and conscious subjective levels of class struggle. Political structure is first overthrown, and then economic relations are rapidly modified to suit the new mode of production. In some important passages of the preface of Critique of Political Economy, Marx described what in his view are the essential of the mechanics of historical development. And these paragraphs are numbered in Jackson's Dialectics, the book I spoke just now about. In the social production of their, I quote, in the social production of their means of life, human beings enter into definite and necessary relations which are independent of their will. Production relations which correspond to a definite stage in the development of their productive forces. The totality of these production relations constitutes the economic structure of society, the real basis upon which a legal and political superstructure arises, and to which definite forms of social consciousness correspond. Man as an individual can produce the means of subsistence for himself alone. Human beings must produce in cooperation with each other, then it will be social production. The mode of production of the material means of life determines, in general, the social, political and intellectual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of human beings which determines their existence, and it is their social existence which determines their consciousness. Quotes closed. Another quote I would cite is, at a certain stage of their developments, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing production relationship. That's why it will change. And or what is a legal expression of the same thing with the property relationships within which they have hitherto moved. So, from forms of development of the productive forces, those relationships turns into fetters upon them. A period of social revolution then begins. In Western Europe, the existence of a heavy plough, for example, three-tier system sustained feudalism. With the coming of the new machinery, the manorial mode of production could not be continued. Earlier, peasants were scattered in homesteads and were tied to the land. Now, the new machinery required separation of serfs from the land. That's why large-scale eviction of peasants from the villages. The changes, therefore, came out of a social revolution caused by class struggle. The class struggle does not necessarily take place between the exploiters and the exploited, though this remains the major struggle. The struggle also takes place between two exploiting classes. In the French Revolution, where exploited class also participated, in the revolution, the struggle ended in the removal of one exploiting class by the other. In all pre-socialist revolutions, this remains the characteristic feature. Just so little can be appraised such a revolutionary epoch in accordance with its own consciousness of itself, the consciousness of the age. On the contrary, we have to explain the consciousness as the outcome of contradictions of material life, of the conflicts existing between social productive forces and production relationships. We can, in broad outline, designate the Asiatic, the classical, the feudal, and modern bourgeois forms of production as progressive epochs in the economic formation of society in a linear manner. Now, Marx explains in 1850s, he came to believe that there was in Asia a different system of class struggle which has not changed. The village communities existed out of which the surplus was extracted by the despotic forces. It had neither slavery nor serfdom. It was a different thing. So, he designated it as the Asiatic mode of production. The bourgeois production relations are the final antagonistic form in the development of social production. And antagonistic not in the sense of antagonism between individuals, but one inherent in life conditions and social circumstances of the individuals. As the time when the productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society are creating material conditions for the solution of that antagonism. In any antagonistic contradiction, the only solution is the removal of one of the contending parties. There could be no compromise in exploitation. For example, the serfs can't say, take this much of the produce no further to the lords. It was not possible. Capitalism is the last exploitative mode of production within which conditions are maturing to overthrow all forms of exploitation. By that he means the rebellion by the workers. The social formation therefore constitute the closing chapters of prehistoric stage of human society. So, at one place he says, no social order is destroyed until all the productive forces for which it gives scope to have been developed. New and higher production relations can't appear until the material conditions for their existence have ripened within the womb of the old social order. Then the new will come. Therefore, mankind in general never sets upon itself the problems it can solve. It cannot solve. Why? Because since looked at more closely, we always find that problem in itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution exist, or at least are already in the process of formation. So, thus we have through Karl Marx attempted to study the historical approach of historians who believe in comprehensive history and present a broad historical framework within which all specific histories can be studied. Then you can have a major contradiction. Thank you very much.